Many people probably think of monarchies as a thing of the past, an old relic from earlier, perhaps more primitive times in human history, when kings, queens, emperors, and the like ruled over their territories and subjects with an iron fist and complete unchecked power. Some historical figures that may come to mind are Louis XIV of France, Queen Elizabeth of England, Nicholas II of Russia, or even Julius Caesar during the tail end of the Roman Republic. Maybe the next thing that comes to mind is how many monarchies and their monarchs, as well as perhaps the rest of the ruling class that they represented, were overthrown or kicked out, and subsequently replaced by leaders of a different form of government, often one that leaned more democratic, or at least claimed to. You might think of the American and French revolutions at the end of the 18th century, which saw the original 13 British colonies in America gain their independence from the United Kingdom and become an independent republic, as well as France temporarily remove its traditional monarchy from power, ultimately leading to its demise in the mid-1800s when it was absolved for good. The consequences of the major events of the 20th century, including World War I, II, and the Cold War, also saw the end of many empires and other monarchies in Europe as well as around the world. The Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, the Kingdom of Italy, and so on. Not to mention the end of the Qing dynasty in China and the collapse of Japan's sphere of influence in Southeast Asia. So, in this context, it's easy to think of the replacement of monarchies by more progressive and democratic forms of government throughout world history as a natural progression of politics and government in any given society. At least, this would likely seem correct to many people living in countries where monarchies previously ruled but were subsequently overthrown, especially in the West, like in the United States, for example. In reality, though, monarchies, real monarchies, not only still exist in many countries, but they also play a large role in the modern world and in global politics, with many nations being partially or almost fully ruled by a monarch with real power and authority. But before we begin discussing the state and role of monarchies in the modern world, it's important to establish what a monarchy actually is. To start with, monarchy and kingdom are not the same thing, even though they might sometimes be used seemingly interchangeably. And similarly, monarch and king are not the same thing either, even though kings might sometimes be referred to as monarchs in historical and other contexts. Yet another term that sometimes gets conflated with monarchy is empire, as well as monarch with emperor, but these aren't the same thing either. So, how exactly are all these different? Well, to start with, both kingdoms and empires are types of monarchies, but not the other way around. And a monarchy, in the simplest terms, is a political entity where a varying degree of power, ranging from mostly ceremonial and symbolic to complete undivided authority, is held by the leader, the monarch, who in most cases passes on their position and their power hereditarily to another member of their family or dynasty upon their death or until they decide to retire, which is uncommon but does occasionally happen. And, as it was just stated, a kingdom is a type of monarchy and can be roughly defined as a political system headed by a monarch, in this case a king, queen, or sometimes both in joint, who rules over a state whose population is often identifiable with one or more main ethnic groups that have ancestral ties to the area, and who passes on their position and power hereditarily within their family, dynasty, upon their death or retirement. But when a kingdom, or any state for that matter, starts conquering and subjugating other kingdoms, states, or maybe just large swaths of territory where different ethnic groups reside and live independently, they then become eligible for empire status. This distinction is important as empires can consist of many kingdoms or other states, but no kingdom or state can consist of different empires. For the most part, the difference between a kingdom and an empire comes down to the literal amount of landmass or area that they rule over and whether they encompass different states, countries, or areas of land where different ethnic groups reside. So, if a state, kingdom or not, conquers a very large amount of land made up of other formerly sovereign states and or areas where different formerly independent ethnic groups reside, that makes it, by most standards, eligible to be considered an empire, although most countries don't like it when you call them that now, or by extension imperialistic. Officially, there are no longer any empires left in the world. That's probably because the term empire has garnered a very negative connotation since the end of the colonial era in the mid-20th century. During the colonial era, being an empire was often associated with great prestige, power, and prosperity, and the idea of empire was usually justified with racist pseudoscience and other inherently flawed arguments, like, if we don't take it, somebody else will. Nowadays, though, being called an empire is like being equated with an evil force of subjugation and exploitation, because that's what empires were, a subjugation and exploitation of foreign states, their land, and people for the benefit of the ruling power, its people, and especially its ruling class. So, now that we know the difference between a monarchy, kingdom, and empire, let's go over which types of monarchies still exist and where. We'll talk about 3 types of monarchies that all fit on a sort of spectrum from least to most authoritative. To start with, let's talk about the likely most well-known modern monarchy in the entire world, the British monarchy. The British monarchy is an example of a constitutional monarchy, a type of monarchy that derives its powers and privileges from and is subject to the rules, laws, principles, and, if one exists, the constitution of the country where it reigns. Funnily enough, the UK is actually one of the few modern democracies in the world that doesn't have a codified constitution, meaning there is no single document that clearly states all constitutional law in the UK. They don't have a single document called the Constitution, like in France, the US, and India, for example. But regardless, they still have a constitution. It's just spread throughout many acts of parliament, conventions, statutes, aspects of common law, legal precedents, and much more. Nevertheless, the British monarchy, or the Crown, is still subject to the UK's constitution and other laws, with some exceptions, that all put restrictions on the Crown's authority and power, which makes it a constitutional monarchy. While we're on the subject of the British monarchy, it's also probably worth mentioning that the British monarch, currently King Charles III, is also the reigning monarch and head of state of 14 other sovereign and totally independent countries, all of which are former British colonies. They are Antigua and Barbuda, Australia, the Bahamas, Belize, Canada, Grenada, Jamaica, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Solomon Islands, and Tuvalu. All of these countries, including the UK itself, are classified as realms of the British monarchy. But enough about the British. The next type of monarchy that we'll discuss today gives its monarch and royal family slightly more power and authority, or significantly more, depending on the monarchy. They are semi-constitutional monarchies. Semi-constitutional monarchies are a type of monarchy where the monarch is given more authority and privileges than monarchs in just constitutional monarchies. The Kingdom of Morocco, for instance, is a good example of a semi-constitutional and parliamentary monarchy that mixes both the traditional and authoritative hierarchy of the Moroccan monarchy and royal family with the democratic and progressive principles of a parliamentary structure of government. But, unlike monarchs in constitutional monarchies, the Moroccan monarch still holds considerable de jure power. For example, the Moroccan monarch, currently King Mohammed VI of the Alauite dynasty, in addition to being the head of state of Morocco, is also endowed with a number of other official roles, titles, and responsibilities. In addition to being the head of state, Mohammed VI, as King of Morocco, is also the country's top religious official with ultimate authority over all religious affairs in the country, has the privilege of choosing the prime minister from the political party which wins a majority in parliamentary elections, can remove ministers from parliament at will, and is the chairman of the Supreme Council of the Judiciary, the highest court in the Kingdom of Morocco. Of course, there is much more to the government and monarchy of Morocco than is described here. But it's quite obvious that the Moroccan monarchy has an undeniable influence and control over governmental affairs in Morocco, and for this reason, the Kingdom of Morocco is considered a semi-constitutional monarchy. By the way, while we're on the subject of Morocco, it's worth briefly mentioning a territorial dispute currently going on directly south of the country. If you look at a map, you'll see that right below Morocco exists an area which is coincidentally shaped pretty similarly to Morocco, and in most cases is either grayed out or separated from Morocco with dotted lines. That's because this area is claimed by 2 countries. The first is Morocco, which refers to the area as the southern provinces of Morocco, and the second is the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, whose government, the Polisario Front, exists in exile in Tindouf, a town in southwest Algeria, but to the outside world it's generally known as Western Sahara. As it stands now, Morocco, and thereby the Moroccan monarchy, administer around 80% of the land in Western Sahara in the west, while the Polisario Front controls just 20% in the east. Other than Morocco, there are 9 other semi-constitutional monarchies in the world, so 10 in total. They're found in many regions and on nearly every continent in the world, including Europe, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. Now that we've discussed constitutional and semi-constitutional monarchies, it's time to talk about the final type of monarchy that we'll cover today, absolute monarchies. It's exactly this type of monarchy that most people likely think of when they hear the word monarchy or kingdom. Absolute monarchies are less in number than constitutional and semi-constitutional monarchies, but there are still several left, 7 in total, or 8 if you count the Vatican. The majority of these are located in the Middle East, but they are also found in Southern Africa, Southeast Asia, and Europe, technically. They are Bahrain, Brunei, Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, UAE, as well as Vatican City. Again, if you're counting it, but for our purposes, we won't. In all these countries, the monarch and the royal family have full, unequivocal power and influence over their country's government, politics, elections, however few there may be, entertainment, freedom of speech and assembly, freedom to practice religion, and just about all other aspects of society. For instance, the King of Bahrain, currently Hamad bin Isa al Khalifa, has complete authority over the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of the Bahrain government and is responsible for electing the country's prime minister, currently his own son, Crown Prince Salman bin Hamad al Khalifa. The king also elects all 40 members of the Consultative Council, the upper house of the National Assembly, Bahrain's legislature. Any and all political parties are banned in Bahrain, and elections for the 40 members of the Council of Representatives, the lower house of Bahrain's legislature, are closely monitored and manipulated by the king and ruling officials via a patronage network and political intimidation. And to make matters worse, King Hamad in recent years has taken steps to reduce the power of parliament via constitutional amendments and royal decrees, further consolidating his rule over the country. Furthermore, the country's Shia Muslim population, which makes up more than half of the country's entire citizen population, has suffered from political oppression for decades now in modern Bahrain. Although they make up the majority, they are consistently underrepresented in Bahrain's cabinet and parliament, and are further disadvantaged in electoral processes by what is essentially political gerrymandering. What's more, in recent years, the Bahrain government has even gone as far as to intentionally recruit larger numbers of Sunni foreigners to serve in Bahrain security forces, with the goal to then grant them Bahraini citizenship in an effort to bolster the country's Sunni population and undo the current Shia majority. But things are even worse for Bahrain's non-citizens, who make up half of the population of the country and have no political rights whatsoever. That's save for the select few who own property in one of the designated areas for expatriates. But since most of Bahrain's non-citizens are migrant workers of low-paying jobs, not to mention the workers who were cheated out of their pay for weeks or months on end by corrupt employers, the vast majority of them have no hope of ever being able to afford their own property there. Similar situations can be found in neighboring Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the UAE, where hereditary monarchs have direct authority over the legislative and judicial branches of government, while of course being the head of state and having enormous executive privileges as well. But, looking away from the Middle East, similar circumstances can be found in two other countries, Brunei Darussalam in Southeast Asia and the Kingdom of Eswatini in Southern Africa. Brunei Darussalam, or just Brunei, is a tiny nation nestled between the Brunei Bay and South China Sea by water and surrounded entirely by Malaysia by land on the island of Borneo in Southeast Asia, and is an Islamic hereditary monarchy ruled by a sultan. Currently, the Sultan of Brunei is Hassan al-Bolkiah, who has been ruling the country since 1967, when Brunei was still a protectorate of the United Kingdom. Bolkiah also became the country's prime minister in 1984 upon Brunei receiving its independence from the UK. As both the Sultan and Prime Minister of Brunei, Bolkiah enjoys a plethora of executive powers, such as being the only person in the country who can finalize and pass any laws, as well as appointing all 33 ministers to the Legislative Council, which is, as the name suggests, the country's legislature. Not only that, but all senior judges in the country on all levels of courts are directly appointed by the Sultan, who of course all have great incentive to remain loyal to and act in the best interests of the person who appointed them. And, as to be expected, political parties and especially opposition groups are banned as well. Just one party, the National Development Party, was granted permission to register as a political party in 2005, but only after swearing a pledge of loyalty to the Sultan. However, as of now, they have no seats in the Legislative Council, as Bolkiah has not appointed anyone from the party to be on the council. And, fun fact about Brunei, the Sultan's wide-ranging privileges and power stem from a state of emergency called in Brunei all the way back in 1962, which gave the monarch the ability to rule with virtually no limitations on his power and is still in effect to this day. This means that Brunei has been in an official state of emergency and headed by a monarch with emergency powers for over 60 years. Moving over to Southern Africa, we find our last absolute monarchy, Eswatini, which, prior to April 2018, was known as Swaziland. Eswatini is a small landlocked nation surrounded entirely by South Africa to the west and Mozambique to the east. It also happens to be the last remaining absolute monarchy in Africa. By the way, be careful not to confuse Eswatini with Lesotho, another small, landlocked, and similarly shaped country to the south of Eswatini, surrounded entirely by South Africa. The current reigning monarch of Eswatini is King Mswati III of the Dlamini dynasty, the largest and most dominant of the more than 70 clans that comprise the ethnic Swazi people. As such, in addition to the king himself, many members of the Dlamini also serve as high-ranking government officials, including current Prime Minister Russell Dlamini, who was appointed to his position by Mswati III after the 2023 parliamentary elections. As king, Mswati holds considerable power over all branches of government. For example, in addition to appointing the Prime Minister, Mswati also gets to personally appoint 10 of the 73 members of the House of Assembly, the lower chamber of the Eswatini Parliament, as well as 20 of the 30 members in the Senate, the upper chamber. Although that theoretically leaves most of the seats in Parliament to popular election, members that aren't appointed directly by the king himself are all subject to extensive vetting by their local clan chiefs, who all represent the king and his best interests in their local communities, and getting their approval is essential for any candidate looking to be elected to Parliament. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there have been many accusations of blatant election interference by clan chiefs, who in the past have allegedly told their constituents who or who not to vote for in elections. But even if after all these challenges, someone with a different agenda from the king and those loyal to him does get elected, any members of parliament looking to push for reforms or act against the king's wishes will likely never find any success, as the king has the authority to veto any and all legislation, and parliament lacks the ability to initiate the passing of any legislation anyway. The judiciary is also entirely under the thumb of the king and royal family. All judges in the country, from those on the Supreme Court of Eswatini all the way down to local tribunals, are appointed by and subject to removal by the king himself. To do this, the king consults with the members of the Judicial Service Commission, the advisory body of the judiciary, but it's also made up of royal appointees. As we have just seen, countries with absolute monarchies share many similarities ubiquitous in authoritarian regimes. From the complete lack of independent political parties and opposition groups to the ruling government and the monarchy, to the gross violations of civil liberties and political freedoms that prevent the common people from fairly participating in their own government. Instead, nepotism runs rampant in these societies, as the hereditary, lifelong rulers often appoint immediate family members or other relatives to other high-ranking positions within the government to assure that their family, or dynasty, maintains their control and grip on the common people. And, if not close relatives, power may also be shared with those more distantly related, or with those who are unrelated but have their own relatives who have established ties and connections to the royal family. Anyone without these connections who somehow manages to find themselves in the royal family's liking must be willing to remain completely subservient and loyal to them. Political dissonance, as well as any type of protest against the government, are usually swiftly and sometimes brutally put down, often leading to an even tighter chokehold on political and social life and even greater limitations on the freedoms of the common people, protesters or not. Of course, journalistic freedom and integrity are also grossly violated throughout all types of media, forcing journalists to practice severe self-censorship when reporting on basically anything at all, and refrain from publishing anything that might be perceived as criticism of any governmental institutions, their members and representatives, or even the country itself, and if not, face the consequences. And, during this entire video, I barely even mentioned the severe lack of protections and special resources for the most vulnerable demographics in these countries, women and minority groups, including ethnic and religious minorities, as well as LGBTQ+ individuals. In all absolute monarchies in the world at the moment, as well as in many semi-constitutional monarchies, discrimination and violence against some or all of these groups are often not taken seriously or even encouraged. But in the end, it's everybody who loses out when just one person with their immediate family and loyalists get to influence and enjoy total control over their society. And that goes for any country, monarchy or not. Thank you for watching.